I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, business and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. Brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards. This week, we consulted our long list of sworn podcast enemies and, noticing that Shotton and MichaelAaron Flicker are far too smart and entertaining to be on it, gladly welcomed them on. Or in Richard's case, back to Call to Action. Making a record third appearance, Richard is, of course, the industry's go-to source for remarkable truths about all things behavioural, having authored books that are almost guaranteed to be well-thumbed to the point of disintegration, including The Choice Factory, The Illusion of Choice, and the giddily anticipated new one, Hacking the Human Mind. Co-authored with his fellow guest, MichaelAaron, who is also co-host with Richard on the annoyingly excellent Behavioural Science for Brands podcast. As well as being one half of the second best marketing podcast around, Michael is the founder and president of Zeeno-Sigh Ventures, a brand incubator firm that provides financial, marketing and intellectual capital to companies. And if writing a book and podding a cast together wasn't enough, the two of them, who I'm told should never be referred to as Rick and Mick, have also founded the Consumer Behaviour Lab, whose mission is to use behavioural science to make the world's marketing and media much more effective and presumably much less annoying. In their upcoming book, they close with, behavioural science has two big benefits. It identifies the truth about what motivates shoppers, but crucially, it also gives you the ammunition to make your ideas impossible to ignore. So what are you waiting for? Welcome to the show, Richard Shotton and MichaelAaron Flicker.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Giles.
No worries, that was a long one. Right, so we've got 8 quick-fire questions, and I'm going to alternate, starting with you, Richard. So a nod to that quote, identify the truth or ammunition to make ideas impossible to ignore.
Identify the truth.
Nice. Right, MichaelAaron, Boston Red Sox or the New England Patriots?
This is very hard because I'm from New York City. I would say Red Sox.
Okay, nice. Richard, be different or be distinct?
Oh, good one. Be different.
Be different. MichaelAaron, this is quite rogue. Han Solo or Hans Brinker?
Han Solo.
Richard, Grey Goose or Red Bull?
Red Bull. I think as a brand, it's the one that probably covers the most behavioural science biases. So yeah, both great brands, but definitely Red Bull.
Okay, nice one. MichaelAaron, Haagen-Dazs or Ben & Jerry's?
Haagen-Dazs, because we spent an entire chapter on it in our book.
Nice. Nice. One of my favourite chapters, I will add. Richard, Oasis or Blur?
Blur, I'm afraid I have to say. Yeah, I did try and get Oasis tickets, but definitely Blur.
Okay, and finally, and rather unfairly, MichaelAaron, The Choice Factory or The Illusion of Choice?
Oh, goodness. The Choice Factory. The original is always so hard to compare to. The Choice Factory.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Okay, well, listen, both, thanks again for joining us. MichaelAaron, we're going to start with you. As I mentioned pre-record, the listeners to Call to Action, I know, get a lot about understanding the paths that people take to the career they find themselves in. So could you talk to us about your first kind of ever jobs growing up and then what you regard to be your first proper job?
Thanks so much for asking. And as you said, as I've listened to the podcast, it's so fascinating how many different routes people take to get into our industry. My story started when I was 14 years old and avid player of video games, spending a lot of time in my parents' basement. And my parents said, you got to go get a job. And as I looked around, kids could get jobs in New Jersey, in the United States, maybe a minimum wage back then was like $5 an hour. And I thought, surely there would be a way to do something where I could make a little bit more money. And so along with the kid that grew up across the street from me, Abraham Long, we were sitting together and we said, what if we created a computer programming company on the internet? And back in the mid 90s, computer programming was only in the domain of mainframes and of serious computer networks. So doing it on the internet was not something that most people spent time thinking about. So we decided to see if we could do projects on the internet. And it was a lovely story of people taking chances on us, giving us the chance to prove ourselves. Our first client was the local school system, the Ridgewood Board of Education. We created online forms for teachers to apply for jobs in the district. Our second job was a person a few blocks away, was a chemical engineer, mechanical engineer, and he gave us a computer programming job. And brick by brick, little by little, we kept doing more and more projects as we grew the company. So we did this throughout high school. We did this throughout college, and, it grew in size and scale, and we added people. But if you had met us at the end of college, we were a computer programming company, and people loved having us around doing programming, solving their business problems with computer programming. But we realized something important, which was they thought we were great builders. They didn't think we were architects. They didn't really want to ask our opinion of how to do something. They just wanted us to do it. So we started creating different disciplines. We started a business consulting discipline. We started a political consulting discipline. We started a marketing and advertising discipline. And over the 15 years that followed, those different disciplines became their own businesses, became their own companies. And we've been growing them since then. And then in the late teens, 2019 into 2020, we got the itch to go beyond just having clients. And we started creating our own brands in the world. So now Zeeno-Sigh Ventures owns 9 different companies. Some of them are professional services companies where we do marketing, advertising, and others of our brands are consumer products in the world where we make premium bamboo compression socks. We make healthier for you soda and a whole bunch of other brands. And so we've cut out the clients and we created brands and we connected our marketing and advertising chops directly with our own brands to consumers. And that's been a lovely journey and a lot of fun. And all along the way, behavioral science has been at the center of how we've connected with consumers, how we've built the brands. And so when Richard and I met, we decided we would create the Consumer Behaviour Lab because it gives us a chance to talk even more and learn even more together and go even deeper in behavioral science. So that's the short journey, Giles.
Yeah. Well, you say short. I mean, that sounds like it spans quite a few kind of twists and turns and no doubt years. How old were you, Michael-Aaron, roughly in the mid-90s when you and Abraham started?
We did our first project together when we were 13 years old, and we formed Zeeno-Sigh when we were 14.
Wow, that's amazing. So not only does that stand out to me because it's so rare to have a story that feels so linear, but I wonder, is it only looking back in the rearview mirror and kind of retelling it from today that it is so linear? Like during this process of however many years that was, close to, I don't know, 30-ish, I would hazard a guess. Did it feel like there were quite a few pivots and twists and turns?
Yeah, a favorite story from Abraham and I, it was our junior year of college, and we had planned all summer to work on these massive client projects we had gotten. And we get home from college and the first day, and we have all of the projects for one reason or another had dried up or had gotten pushed later in the year, and we had no work to do. And however successful we had thought we were staring at each other in my parents' basement saying, we better figure out what to do because there was literally no jobs for us. So yeah, lots of twists and turns. And in fact, when we graduated college, we both said we might work at Zeeno-Sigh only for the rest of our lives. And we both wanted to try something. So Abraham went and took a job at Microsoft and I took a job at the US Senate. So for a short period of time, while we did Zeeno-Sigh on the side, we were trying other real jobs. But yeah, it led me back to Zeeno-Sigh. And happily, Abraham's still at Microsoft 20 years later.
Wow. Fantastic. That's such a satisfying response to my question. That's lovely. I must say, just to our listeners, I'm sure everyone listening is familiar with both the previous episodes we've recorded with Richard, including our inaugural episode 6.5 years ago. So instead of recovering ground we have voiced already, Richard, you wanted to share a tribute.
Yeah, and I should stress I'm not a huge heavy metal fan by any means, but I'm quite a regular reader of the obituaries. And there was an amazing story that came out after Ozzy Osbourne died about how Black Sabbath got their first big break, to how they started their career. And I thought it was quite an interesting one, because I think there's lessons for anyone want to make a break in advertising. So what happened was they had started as a bit more of a bluesy band. They struggled to get much coverage. And their tactic for getting their first big gig was to go to venues. They brought all their equipment, all their sound stuff. And this was all on the long shot of the original headline and not turning up. And they did this time after time, complete waste of evenings. And then eventually, Jethro Tull were meant to be playing. For some reason, they don't turn up at the gig. And Black Sabbath were there, ready and waiting to go. They do the gig, get lots of plaudits, they get lots of press. And that's what kickstarted them into the mainstream, as it were.
Fantastic.
I think it's an interesting story for a couple of reasons, because if you are trying to break into marketing now, there's a lot that you can learn from Black Sabbath. I think that idea of putting yourself out there to be luckier. It wasn't just luck that they turned up one night and Jethro Tull weren't there. They had turned up night after night after night. And I think it's a bit like that Arnold Palmer saying, the more I practice, the luckier I get. So a lot of these things don't come without a huge amount of effort. But then effort alone probably isn't enough. It wasn't them like sending off thousands of CVs. They very creatively thought of a way that they could get a much higher profile gig than normal. And then the third bit, I suppose, is you've got that creativity, that hard work. And then the bit I really like, it's almost kind of ignoring what the rules are. The normal way of getting a first gig, I suppose, is to get an agent and then fire off loads of emails or phone calls. They did something quite radically different. And I think that way of separating yourself from the competition, I think that's something that we could all learn from a bit more. So I love that. And Ozzy Osbourne died a couple of days ago, so it seems quite an appropriate one to learn from.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of lowering the tone, I'm just going to read out a short thing on Ozzy that I learned in the last few days about how and why he decided to stop taking acid. He said, I took 10 tabs of acid and I went for a walk in a field. I ended up standing there talking to this horse for about an hour. In the end, the horse turned round and told me to fuck off. That was it for me.
Well, there's a lesson every stage of Ozzy's life.
I don't know what the lesson is, but there is certainly a lesson there. So can I ask, when did your paths cross then, Richard and MichaelAaron? And then how did that materialize into this new book, which of course we need to tuck into, Hacking the Human Mind?
Richard, you are generously teaching, right?
Yeah, so I was doing a course for a company called the 4As. So they're a bit like the IPA, but in America. MichaelAaron came along to that. We got chatting afterwards. And then, both have this shared love of behavioural science. So decided it might be worth trying to work together. And then after a very short time, we decided to try and launch this podcast, Behavioural Science for Brands, where we take a single brand each week and then try and take a learning. What is that brand? What principle from behavioural science is that brand employed to drive its success? And once we'd had done a few of those episodes, we began to discuss whether, there was enough here to form the basis of a book. So that was the kind of potted history.
Yeah, and in some ways, I guess you could suggest it's the reverse of your previous two books, right? Where you would talk about the behavioural science observation or the heuristic and then how that might be applied.
Yeah, absolutely. So choice, factor, illusion, choice are very much every chapter, even the half chapter, they are based around a single bias. So it might be the pratfall effect or social proof. There's a little bit on what that bias is, the academic evidence, the experiments I've done, and then the practical implications. And what we did differently this time was think, well, let's start with the brand. So whether it's Haagen-Dazs or Dyson, little potted history about what that brand's done so brilliantly, and then try and explain some of their success, not the entire success, that'd be ridiculous, but some of their success from using one or two behavioural science principles. And that different approach, I think, has worked really well because it just grounds these academic ideas that can sometimes be a bit abstract in a very easy to understand, practical form.
And I think that was one of the big reasons we got so excited about this was we want people to use the behavioral science insights to make their marketing better. Sometimes it's hard to remember, well, what exactly is the pratfall effect, or what are all the ways you can make social proof? But it's much easier, or we felt after talking about it, that you can really remember when Steve Jobs was on stage introducing the iPad, or when you see the Haagen-Dazs label, and then all of a sudden you can say, oh, I remember how to use this insight or how they used it, and then how can I apply it to the situation I'm facing? So really, we felt that inverting the order made it more applicable for everybody who's reading the book or listening to the podcast to turn it into action.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I think avoiding the abstract, to steal Richard's words there, is important, because as you say, that's all very well. I've learned about this heuristic, but how does that apply to me is probably most people's mindset if they're looking at it something the other way around. Were there any highlights for you both in terms of the content or even the process of writing together? Because I've had the privilege of talking to numerous authors of all shapes and sizes and experiences on the podcast. I always find it very interesting how they write. And we've had everything from Pauline Tanner. I remember she talks about the vomit edit, where she would literally, I should say metaphorically, throw everything out, and then she'd sort of, her edit process would then tidy up and tighten. It's hard enough to write a book if you're just one person. How does it work with two?
Well, I think you get an advantage often with two, because there's this idea of the curse of knowledge.
Yeah.
I can never quite remember who did the study. It might have been Elizabeth Dunn. But it's this wonderful study where she gets pairs of people and she splits them in half. And one of them is the rapper and one of them is the listener. And she gives the rapper a list of nursery rhymes. So you pick, say, Bo Peep or whatever, or, Mary Had a Little Lamb. And then you have to, once you pick that nursery rhyme, you don't tell the other person what you're doing, but you rap out on the table with your knuckles the beat of the song. And the listener has to try and guess what the tune is. Now, before the listener makes that guess, if it was Elizabeth Dunn, she goes up to the rapper and says, what do you think is the chance that the listener is going to guess what tune you've just played out? And they think it's something ridiculous, like 50 or 60 or 70% of people. The listener, though, when they make their guess, they don't have a bloody clue what the other person was rapping out on the table. It's just this series of completely unconnected sounds. It's about 2% of people manage to correctly guess the right tune. And her argument, psychologist's argument, is this is an example of curse of knowledge. Now, it's very hard to put yourselves in the shoes of another person. It's very hard to remember what it was like not to know something. So I think there's a real danger with any writing is what you're putting down on paper is absolutely clear in your own mind. Someone else picks it up and they're confused by the fact you've almost started that conversation halfway through. So I think the great thing with looking at each other's writing is you've got that check before it gets to the public. There's always another person who can say very clearly and very concisely if it's not abundantly clear. And I think that has really helped.
And to build on that, it took a little bit of rounds for me to build the psychological safety to say to Richard, I'm not sure I still get this. We would go forth and back, and very rarely, Richard, in the whole writing process, was there things we disagreed on. We might have had different emphases, or we might have felt there was different ways to say it. But I think in the whole almost 2 years that we wrote the book, we agreed on much, but how to explain it and having the confidence to say to one another, I'm not really sure that gets to what we mean it to say, was quite a nice, building a psychological safety, building trust with one another. If I had to admit it here, Giles, I would say I was a little nervous in the beginning to say, I'm not sure I get what we're trying to say,
Yeah. Well, good on you for saying that. I love the term psychological safety. And funnily enough, it's made me immediately think of a couple of businesses I know, which are effectively family-owned businesses. And I wonder if that psychological safety must just be so much easier to reach within families, not to suggest that there aren't plenty of cons to working with family too.
You certainly start at a different level when you're working with your brothers, sisters, parents, kids. I would imagine you also carry a lot of extra stories and history that color that. So yeah, I would imagine it cuts both ways.
Yeah. And then going over the book, there's a few chapters that really stood out for me. And I'm dying to talk about Haagen-Dazs simply because I'm obsessed with, and I don't think this is a term you necessarily use, but something called the country of origin effect, and how consumers perceive products and brands based on their country of origin, which of course is a key part that you talk about in the book. Are either of you happy to share the core story and findings from that wonderful chapter?
It's a great story. So there are two emigrants from Poland and Ukraine, Ruben Mattis and his wife. They come over to Brooklyn. They start getting involved with their family ice cream business. And eventually they decide, look, we're going to try and launch our own expensive ice cream. Other people are selling it for 50 cents a pint. We're going to sell it for 75 cents. They want it to be this luxury ice cream. And Ruben Mattis has this idea that, well, if we want to make it sound like it's exotic and impressive, let's not say it's from Brooklyn, let's say it's from Denmark. So they come up with this name Haagen-Dazs, which essentially is a name they think sounds Danish. And neither of these people has ever been to Denmark. They have no idea really what Danish words are like. They don't speak Danish. And actually, if you look at the word Haagen-Dazs, even though it gives this impression to an American ear in the 1940s of being Danish, actually, the Danes never put an umlaut over the A. The AZ of Das is never a kind of a term that's used in Danish. So it's this very kind of fake Danish brand. But they thought it sounded Danish for an American ear, and they put a little map of Denmark on the original packaging. And their idea was it will taste different to people. Now, if people eat something thinking it's been made round the corner in Brooklyn, it might feel very, matter of fact, very mundane. If they think it's traveled halfway around the world, suddenly it gets this kind of exotic sense that people will think it's more premium, worth more paying for. So it's a little bit of a dodgy story in certain ways. It's a little bit misleading on Haagen-Dazs' part. But I think it was a fascinating one as a real world example of how the story that goes around your brand will change the very perception of it and how people engage with it, change the very taste of the food.
And of all the chapters we wrote that we were thinking about what's the message we want to leave the reader with, this one was a little trickier for us. It was a different time when the Mattises created Haagen-Dazs. But today, Richard and I were saying, would we really endorse a brand having a foreign branding that's not authentic? Our decision in the book is to say, everyone should decide for themselves where that line is, but you can learn a lot from the idea that you can use these names to change people's perceptions. So if you're in the restaurant industry, rather than calling it a vegetarian dish, you could think about calling it field grown, or field grown is better than meat free. Or if you're in the travel industry, rather than calling it a booking fee, booking fee will likely be better than a service cost. So there's ways to rename and change the way that you refer to things to get a better reaction from your buyer.
Yeah.
Some of those effects can be really quite large. Like my favorite example, probably in the whole book, how changing the name of various fish has changed their popularity. So we talk a little bit about the story of the Patagonian toothfish. So back in the 70s, there was an entrepreneur called Lee Lantz, and he had got the rights to, work with a huge number of fishermen down in Chile to buy these Patagonian toothfish, which had a very nice taste. He tries to sell them to New York restaurants, and these restaurants basically laugh in his face. They're like, who the hell is going to buy a Patagonian toothfish? It sounds ugly. No one's going to want to put that in their mouth. So Lantz has a little think, and then he eventually decides, well, why don't I just rename this fish and call it the Chilean sea bass? And then once he does that, there is a completely different reaction from those chefs. And it got to the stage where over the next 20 years or so, the volume of imports of the Patagonian toothfish, which are now becomes Chilean sea bass, it went up 30-fold. Now, it's exactly the same product, but the appeal of it and the taste of it vary according to what it's labeled. And that single story has been repeated again and again and again in the world of fish. You used to have dolphin fish, but no one wants to eat dolphin fish because everyone loves a dolphin, even though dolphin fish got nothing to do with dolphin. But they renamed it mahi-mahi. Mud bugs didn't sound very appealing, so they renamed them crawfish. Again and again, you see this idea that exactly the same product, you change the label and you get a very, very different reaction. But so often people think to themselves, if I just make my product good enough, then it will generate demand. What these examples and the experiments behind them show is a great product is not enough. You need to match it with that amazing label.
Yeah, funny enough, your quickfire, Richard, was going to be Patagonian toothfish or Chilean sea bass. And I realised I'd asked you that 2 years ago.
Oh, really? Oh, my God.
No, it's always one of my favourite stories too. But there's a few in there. And in fact, that chapter does kind of share a few more, like variety meats and so on and so forth. I remember suggesting to someone recently that skin on fries should just be called "We couldn't be asked to peel your potatoes fries."
Yeah, lovely example. Well, the skin on. Anyway, yeah.
But it is funny, isn't it? Because, I mean, you've both touched on whether it's kind of, I suppose, morally or if not, I suppose, ethically, how you would conclude, given there was a, probably fair to say, inauthenticity behind the name. But I suppose when you're working with brands, especially when you're positioning brands, effectively, you're trying to lean into any kind of pre-existing associations that might be carried in the consumer's brain anyway. And maybe it's just my opinion, but personally, I think I find the story of Haagen-Dazs even more satisfying knowing that they are not a Danish brand. I think it's really interesting. Do people's perception of the brand change once they discover that they're not a Danish brand, I wonder? Because it was, yes. I remember hearing about Superdry not being an Asian brand a few years ago, and that did alter my perception of the brand, I won't lie.
So you're absolutely right. There is a experiment we cover by, I think it's Thomas Acher at the University of Padova, like 2017 study, where he actually goes up to people in supermarkets and sometimes reveals that Haagen-Dazs is from Brooklyn. And according to claim data, and you've got to be a bit careful with claim data, there is a 68% drop in willingness to buy the product. So absolutely, if people feel they've been deceived or they are told the truth, then absolutely there's a change in that preference. But I would go back to that point of thinking, look, the Patagonian toothfish, Haagen-Dazs, they're very striking examples. They're very funny examples because they're so extreme. But the real learning is not to pull the wool over people's eyes. It's to recognize that in many situations, there is no authentic label. There is no neutral position. And it's up to you to pick something that frames the situation in a positive and strong way as possible. So one of my favorite examples for e-commerce people is a lovely study by Peterson. Lovely big sample, over 1,000 people. And he gets them to do a e-commerce journey and they have to buy an item. And on every occasion, that item isn't there. They just can't buy it. It's not there to buy. Now, the twist in the experiment is sometimes that item is labeled out of stock. Sometimes it's labeled unavailable. Sometimes it's labeled sold out. And when Peterson later questions people as to their level of irritation, he sees this really clear pattern that if people think the product was sold out, their irritation is about 15% less than if it was unavailable or out of stock. Now, his argument for this is it's all about the associations that come with those words. If you say the product's unavailable, what you as a retailer are drawing attention to is the fact that you are inept. You couldn't get your logistics sorted in time. But if you label that product as sold out, well, what you're drawing attention to is the fact that there has been huge demand for the product. Now, it's being desired, it's the unexpected demand that's led to it not being there. And that taps into social proof, and that makes that product more desirable, more wanted. So it's not just these kind of big, slightly dubious examples in the chapter. We also have these very practical ones that you could apply without any of that kind of moral minefield.
Time, weather, and...
We interrupt this podcast to announce that we will never interrupt this podcast with ads. Ads that awkwardly nudge you to contact the pod's host, Giles Edwards. Only last week, some pod listening companies did just that, calling for guidance on proper marketing. But we're not asking you to do that. Nope. Anyway, back to the show.
Okay, so...
marketing is incredibly confused with sales.
I think you're the one who's more confused, Gary V. Sunshine. Here we go.
Something else that really stood out for me, in fact, and it might be because of the parallels between the stories that you share and typically the parallels that are shared in, say, marketing media and the marketing press. One of the criticisms I think people have of the latter is that we're always talking about big brands and you know, not everyone is a big multinational brand, and therefore you can question whether the lessons apply. Now, the stories in your book are of big brands, or a lot of them are big brands, but normally you're touching on the reason why they've become so big. So it's just like everything from, say, Five Guys and the origins of Five Guys to, I don't know, KFC and their secret recipe. They just feel so much more wildly applicable to everyone than your standard marketing case study.
And the other thing we've tried to add in every chapter, and part of the focus of our podcast is there an academic study that can help back up the observation that you have about why the brand has done well? So on their own, you know, just hearing a marketing case study in the industry presses sometimes can feel like revisionist history. On their own, just an academic paper can sometimes feel like it's lacking practical application. But when you push them together and you can see through the lens of the peer-reviewed academic study why the creative could have been as successful or the brand might have been perceived that way because of it, it just helps give a more holistic understanding to what's going on.
That overlap of case study plus experiment is crucial, because any of the brands, you know, Five Guys, Haagen-Dazs, Amazon Prime, you know, it's not like they were doing one thing at launch. They're complicated entities. They were doing hundreds of things concurrently. So just looking at a case study, it's very hard to know which of those 100 things was amplifying their success, which was detracting from it. But what we did was look at all their different activities and then overlay this lens of behavioural science and said, which of the things were they doing that also there was experimental evidence that shows in controlled conditions and experimental conditions that intervention works. So I think we've got rid of a lot of the noise and focus on much more on the signal of what drove some of that early success.
Yeah. You've used the word signal there, and it's reminded me of something I was going to ask you, which was the book itself. So the book is due, and correct me if I'm wrong, is due to be available on the 30th of September. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, I noticed, and I say this with love and respect, but I noticed that the Kindle version has quite a pricey, punchy price tag. And I was wondering, everything I know about signaling would lead me to think that surely this book should solely be available in the heaviest stock hardback copy possible. And have you used price on the Kindle version to kind of work around that?
So, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about Book Together is, we're working with a brilliant publisher called Haagen-Dazs. They did the previous two books. But when it comes to price, you set the RRP, you know, the recommended retail price. But what Amazon actually charge is completely up to them.
Yeah.
So if you follow the price on a daily basis, it just fluctuates up and down. Amazon, especially once it's actually launched, they're trying to find what is the optimal price to maximize sales. So I don't think Amazon give a monkeys about the signaling value of the benefit it might give to MichaelAaron and me. So I think they are solely trying to maximize profits in the short term. But it's an interesting thing. You spend all this time creating a product, and then one of the key levers is out of your control.
Yeah.
And it happens so often for brands that don't sell direct to consumer or don't have owned and operated stores, that there's only so much that you can control in the entire brand experience. You know, at some point it's on a retail shelf and it's being marked down or marked up. You know, it's on a retail shelf and it doesn't look as good as you had hoped it would when it came right out of the shipping packaging. So there are those elements that marketers and brands always need to be thinking about beyond their control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so easy to kind of idolize a brand for certain reasons of which they're, you know, relatively consistent on, but then finding something that feels quite rogue compared to their standard, you know, behavior or way they kind of manifest in the market, simply for that very reason that there's so many teams of people in so many parts of the world with so many different agendas controlling something. I'm slightly mindful of time. I've had dozens of listener questions, and typically we ask two, but I'd quite like to cram a few in. And I think this will lead to certain parts of the book. So if you're happy, I'm going to go there now.
Let's do it.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger. We're going to start with from Philip Oakley, who's a brilliant marketer based in the States. Philip says the Choice Factory came out in 2018. Since then, have any of the key biases changed, been reinforced, or become more evident?
I would say generally, most of these biases are about the fundamentals of human nature. So they don't change year in, year out. The technological big change since the Choice Factory is AI and ChatGPT and others. And interestingly, you can see some of the existing biases affecting how people interact with those new technologies. So it's not that the bias change, it's the way it expresses itself maybe varies. If that all sounds a bit vague, I'll give you an example. So there's a wonderful set of studies that we cover in the Dyson chapter around the illusion of effort. So it's this idea that exactly the same product will be perceived quite differently dependent on whether people think lots of effort's gone into it or a little effort. So they essentially are using effort as a proxy for quality. Now, the original studies were done back in 2005 by Andrea Morales. But in 2023, there's a brilliant Dutch psychologist called Kobe Millet, who's a VU, big university in Amsterdam. And he wondered how this bias interacted with AI. So he gets a group of people together and he shows them posters. And sometimes those posters are labeled as having come from a AI robot. Other times they're labeled as having been hand-drawn. And what Millet finds is that on all the metrics he looks at, people prefer the poster if they think it's hand-drawn. So I think for purchase intent, there is a 61% higher score if people think it's been hand-drawn. Now, Millet's argument is this is an example of the illusion of effort. Because our personal experience with ChatGPT and Claude is that it spits out an answer in seconds, we assume AI products are, low effort, and therefore we judge them harshly. So that bias has always been there, the illusion of effort. But I think we're now seeing there's a really interesting interaction with some of the latest technology. And what it suggests is if you are speeding up product delivery or you're creating products that are obviously drawing on AI, even if that's what your client's asking for, they will judge that product as lower quality than if they thought you'd put lots of effort in. So what you need to do is not just draw attention to the speed of delivery. You need to draw attention as the provider to the amount of effort that it took to get to the place where you can churn it out really quickly. All the prototypes or protocols you went through. So I think that's a fascinating example of a bias existing forever, but maybe being expressed slightly differently now that technology is changing so rapidly.
Yeah, that reminds me, actually, I think it was a Dave Trott blog, but just as likely to be one of yours, Richard, or in fact, maybe Dave stole it from you. Who knows? I'm sure he's done that.
I'm sure
before.
it's more likely the other way around.
Yeah, there we go. It was a story about locksmiths, and I'm sure the point...
That's a Dan Ariely story, I think, originally.
Oh, is it Dan Ariely? About how most locksmiths could get through your door in seconds, but they don't because you wouldn't be so happy to pay them their fee if they didn't make it look trickier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he talks about, he met like an old locksmith at the kind of end of his career. And the locksmith has said to him, look, when I was a 20-year-old man, I could, turn up to someone's house, but I was useless. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd damage the door. It'd take me an hour to get the lock out. But I got these massive tips. But he said the strange thing was, as he got better at his job and he became an expert, his tips dried up because he would now turn up, whip the lock out straight away and not damage the door. He would objectively do a better job. But because he did it so quickly, people begrudged handing over the fee. So I think that was what inspired Dan Ariely to start looking at this link between effort, fairness, and willingness to pay.
Amazing. Great answer. A question here from Graham Roger. Graham says, this is about water filters. Would you advise framing filtration as avoiding a negative, e.g. toxins, or gaining a positive, i.e. well-being and peace of mind?
Richard and I have talked about this over the years. And once you introduce a negative into the conversation, you are almost always starting from a spot that you have to now battle that. So we have some research that Richard can call upon about doing, starting with the positive, and it just gives you the better place to start and advance from. So Richard, we would say that starting with the positive in this instance would probably be the stronger way to go.
I think it's an interesting one because there are a series of experiments into the idea called the ostrich effect. So the original studies were George Lowenstein at Carnegie Mellon, and he got access. I think it was Vanguard data. So this is anonymous Vanguard data. This is a big fund provider in the US, and essentially he could look at tens of thousands of people and how often they checked into their stock portfolio. And the key finding was that when the S&P 500, the American stock market, or basket of the American stocks is rising, people are checking their stocks reasonably regularly. But when the S&P begins to drop, people check their portfolios far less often. Now, to Lowenstein, this is like a bit strange. He says, look, the information is equally valuable, whether it's going to bring you good news or bad news. But he says, people are not behaving like cold calculating machines. They are being driven by a desire to avoid painful information. They're literally behaving like ostriches. They are sticking their head in their sands to avoid this negative information. So I always think negatives are dangerous if you are, a charity, maybe trying to stop people smoking. There's a real danger that if you use these fear tactics, then you tip into the ostrich effect and people actually metaphorically stick their head in their sands and they ignore what you're saying. They turn away from what you're saying. They don't engage with it, or they do mental gymnastics to ignore your argument. So I'm with MichaelAaron that there is often a danger in the negative, but I do think that's the extreme negative. There are some occasions when you've got a bit of an upside, and that goes into this idea of loss aversion. So the original studies were done back in 1973 by Tversky and Kahneman, and they essentially showed an equivalent loss will move us much more than the same sized gain. So what I mean by that is, if on the way home tonight, Giles, you realize you have lost a fiver, you'll be very unhappy. Someone else out there will have spotted that fiver and picked it up. Yes, they'll be happy, but their level of happiness will not counterbalance your unhappiness. Even though it's exactly the same mathematical amount, there's a difference in impact. So that was the kind of original finding. But the best study that I know of that demonstrates that is this 1988 study from Elliot Aronson. So he goes around homes, 404 homes, knocks on the door, tries to sell people insulation. And sometimes he says to people, if you buy this insulation, you'll save 75 cents a day. And about 40% of people want more information. Other houses, so the other half of houses, knocks on the door, gives them the same spiel, but at the end he says, if you don't take out insulation, you'll be wasting 75 cents a day. You'll lose 75 cents a day. So it's exactly the same mathematical amount, but by framing it as a loss, it motivates people about 50% more. I think it's 55% more. You get up to 60% of people wanting to find out more information. So as long as you could avoid that ostrich effect, as long as you don't scare people and get them sticking their head in the sand, I think sometimes that focus on losses is a missed opportunity by brands.
Richard, we have the Turnwald study from 2017 where Bradley Turnwald from Stanford University does the 4 different descriptions of healthy eating. Is that an applicable study here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different. So what Turnwald does is he works with a cafeteria. He randomly assigns a label to various different foods. So sometimes he'll say low calorie beetroot is the label. So this is the kind of loss deprivation label. Other times he'll say twisted beetroots with citrus dressing. That'll be the appeal. He's focusing on the taste. And what he finds is in that setting, you've got, I think it's about 40% greater sales when you focus on appeal over kind of duty. So I think in the world, I'm with you on the world of foods. I think there's a real danger. If you're trying to sell healthy food, I would definitely argue focus on the taste, the immediate benefit, not the kind of long-term diet benefit. But I just think the filtration might be a slightly different one. But I definitely, I think in the world of food, I'd completely agree.
Yeah, I mean, I need to accept that asking you both a binary question is hugely unfair because the answer is certainly going to be grayscale. But what strikes me there is that obviously context plays a huge role here, because I'm sure, again, forget where I first heard it, but in Italy you start off with 10 points on your license, and when you're caught speeding you lose points, rather than in the UK where you gain points. And I'm sure I've heard that in the context of loss aversion, and losing points actually feels worse than gaining them.
Yeah, and I think that's the brilliant thing with these experiments is it's all about matching the right experiment to the right challenge. So it's not I think a simple, this thing always works, that thing always works. It does depend on the bit on the situation. And for me, the one with loss aversion is really, does it start to tip into this world of fear-mongering and scare? And I think in public service announcements, you often see them going too far in trying to shock people out of their behavior. I think that can really backfire.
Yeah, so if the water filtration is on the house and it's seen more as a utility that you come out of your faucets, you may feel very differently and advertise it very differently than if it's a water pitcher that goes on your table each night and you think of it's still water filtration, but the way that the product that you're buying and the way that you use it is very different. Different behavioral biases might apply.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I've not really considered that. Good answers. Well, I'm going to try and squeeze one more. We had another question from Jen. Jen says, what behavioural principles do marketers not use enough? Again, that's probably quite a challenging one to answer. So even if it's, one that they don't use enough or your favourite, maybe there's something there you can respond to.
We started the whole book, and how do you introduce the book was a big question for Richard and I. And we started with a story of 5 guys. And the lesson we were looking to teach was the goal dilution effect. So founder Jerry Morrell was inspired with his sons when they were walking down a boardwalk one day, and they saw that there was a massive line for a stand that only sold one thing, French fries. And there was lots of other stands that sold many things, but this simplicity that there was only one thing they sold was part of what they brought into when they launched Five Guys. They do just burgers and fries. They don't do chicken. They don't do salads. They don't do ice cream. And so when we went to look at what behavioral insight could we bring to this, we found a 2007 study by Zhang and Fishback at the University of Chicago. And in it, they were looking to describe how eating tomatoes could achieve either one goal, helping prevent cancer, or 2 goals. It can help prevent cancer and degenerative diseases of the eye. And so when participants were asked to rate how effective eating tomatoes was at achieving the first goal versus both, strangely, people rated just eating tomatoes as 12% more effective at preventing cancer when it was given as the only benefit compared to being listed along with the other goal. So it wasn't logical, but people were more confident when it was just one advantage presented rather than 2. And so you can see so many marketers will stack RTBs. They'll take all the benefits of their product and try to squeeze it on the label, squeeze it into a TV commercial, when focusing on one thing, surprisingly, can have more believability and more effect.
Yeah, fantastic. The other thing I love about that story, which is slightly off point, I agree, is that Jerry had effectively given his boys the choice of either starting a business or going to college, which is so wonderful. I never knew that about Five Guys.
Yeah, and it's the 5 guys he had 4 sons. So it's him and the 4 sons of the original 5 guys, which is nice. I always like to see those stories about things you've seen a million times and not quite realise that there's a relevance to them. There's a story behind the facade.
Yeah. It makes it so much more satisfying. The final part of the interview then, and apologies to anyone whose question we didn't get to ask, but we're creeping ever closer to the hour allocated. So I'm going to move to 4 pertinent posers. Start with you, MichaelAaron. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I would say to not be afraid to show academic interest and to show knowledge as a way to convince people to do things. I think my younger self felt that being too nerdy, being too academic was a disadvantage in the cool world of marketing and advertising. And I think that shedding that story has been positive and healthy for me.
Yeah. I particularly liked, by the way, when your first answer that you gave on the podcast was talking and you acknowledge moving from being builders to architects. So I feel like there's a parallel there with what you've just said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think that is part of how I see it. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Anything to add there, Richard?
Yeah, I think for me, maybe a personal one. I think there's a danger, especially when you first start out, that you are too fearful. So there's a brilliant study by Thomas Gilovich, who's at Cornell. So I think it's a 2000 study where he recruits loads of people. And he says, I want you to come in tomorrow, 10 a.m., and you're going to do some maths puzzles. And all those people turn up for the experiment. But one of the people have been told the wrong start times. They turn up 15 minutes late. And Gilovich says to them, okay, yeah, I think we can probably squeeze you in. Oh, before you go in, can you just put this T-shirt on as part of the study? And it is a T-shirt with a picture of Barry Manilow on the front. So if people are...
I wonder where my T-shirt went.
Yeah. It's been taken by a classic psychology study. If it was in the future Barry Manilow is, all you need to know is this would, even in 2000, a deeply, deeply uncool.
Yes.
So the person goes into the room, they put their Barry Manilow T-shirt on, and there are those 20 other people tapping away, answering maths puzzles. The person in the Barry Manilow shirt sits down, gets out his laptop to start as well, and about a minute in, the psychologist taps him on the shoulder and says, oh, I'm really sorry. I think you were so late. This just isn't going to work. Come on out, please. And then once they've removed the person from the room, they do a little bit of a debrief. And when they're giving them their cash for taking part, they ask them, what percentage of people do you think noticed your shirt? And the average answer is 46%. So people assume about half of those 20 people in the room have spotted the T-shirt. Then Gilovich goes and talks to the 20 people in the room, and he asks them, what T-shirt was that guy who came in and out quite quickly wearing? And less than a quarter of people, 23% of people, can remember what T-shirt it was. So Gilovich calls this the spotlight effect. And he does loads of other studies to try and prove that it doesn't just work in that one weird situation. But it's essentially the idea that all of us think we're the heroes of our own story. All of us think that other people are paying loads of attention to what we're doing. But Gilovich says that's just not true. Everyone is caught up in their own story. Those people who are doing the maths puzzles, they would think about themselves, not some chap that wanders in. And when I first read about that, I found that really interesting because it's kind of liberating. Because what it says is, if you screw up, if you do something embarrassing, if you trip over your words, most people are not going to notice. Just carry on regardless. I think that takes a lot of pressure off. But then the other half of it is, especially if you're starting out in your kind of career, if you do something amazing, don't expect most people to notice it. You've probably got to be doing a little bit of internal PR to your kind of colleagues. It's not necessarily the best person that gets promoted. It's often a combination of the best person and the best self-promoter. So I think that Gilovich study, I wish I'd read that when it came out, which is pretty much when I was starting the industry.
No, that's really, really good to know. Funny enough, I'm going to share that with my 9-year-old daughter who I think overthinks these things.
Yeah, I have tried sharing it with my daughter and my son. And my daughter's response was pretty brusque, which was along the lines with probably a few more swear words in, which is, why do I have to try and turn everything into a bloody life lesson? Just be careful on how you position that one.
I might get someone who isn't her dad to tell her about it.
Yeah, the messenger effect, yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And then number 2 then, if you could banish one thing from the industry, MichaelAaron, what would it be and why?
I would banish extremes in data. I mean, I think we've spoken a little bit in the podcast about how much more digitized advertising and marketing is, how much more AI is here. And I think we see these extremes, either that everything must be measured and data to support the arguments of whether marketing, advertising, brand promotion is working. And the other extreme, there's people that say, well, you just can't measure it. And I think probably banishing those extremes and agreeing that there's data that can be created for anything. And if we can agree on what's the right amount of measurement, what's the right amount of research to have confidence in the way you're promoting a brand, I think that would make a healthier industry.
I love that. I think agreeing the right amount, what that right amount is with a client, would certainly make agency jobs much, much more kind of effective. But I think you're right. You could probably point that in most industries. Really smart. I also wonder with like data versus science. I mean, there's probably definitely recency bias here, but I had the pleasure of interviewing Byron Sharp a couple of days ago from Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And one of the points that he has made numerous times in the past is the perceived overlap that doesn't really exist with quantity of data and actual science. And I think that you can't move for data, to your point, but actually very little of it really represents anything particularly scientific or true in that instance. Brilliant.
Yeah. And final comment on it, that there's really valuable data from observed actions rather than, clicks and time on site or velocity and rate of sale. What you observe people doing when they are not being asked a research question, even if it's more qualitative, can really uncover lots of truths about what you're doing.
Yeah. Richard, I know you're looking forward to this question. I think you were going to struggle to choose one, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
So I could have overlapped with MichaelAaron in it would certainly be around the kind of world of data and research, but it would be for me that there is a habit in the industry of reports coming out with a headline finding that is completely at odds with the actual data that research body has created. Now, I think that happens quite regularly. And I think maybe last time we talked about the divergence between the research on purpose and then the claims made for it. So I won't go into that again. But the area that I'm fascinated by at the moment is this claim that keeps on doing the rounds that trust in advertising has collapsed. So you see it from Edelman, you see it from the AA, so Advertising Association. If you look at the research underlying those bodies, you get a very, very different picture. So the AA, for example, they produce reports saying arresting the decline of public trust in advertising. But if you look at the actual data they've done, there is no information or no data they've created that shows that there has been that decline. So what they did was they look at two metrics: favorability towards advertising and then trust in advertising. Now, favorability, they have data going back to 1992. And what you see is there is a steep decline in favorability, 92 to 2011. And then 2011, it's flat. Their trust data only goes back to 2011, and it's flat between 2011 and the end of their research. And what they essentially say is, well, because trust and favorability were both flat post 2011, we don't have any data on trust in the past, but because these two metrics moved together in those 7 or 8 years, we are making the assumption that trust has also collapsed. Now, you put it that way, and no one would agree with that logic.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane. How many other things were flat between 2011 and 18 that didn't collapse in the previous 20 years? That data set is very clearly talked about in their work, but because they've put this headline, public trust is collapsing, that's the thing that just gets reported endlessly. Yeah. And it's quite depressing that like a weak argument where the data doesn't back up the final argument is so widely disseminated.
Yes, and then gets kind of used and cited elsewhere as fact, no doubt, as you say. Yeah, that's awful. Are there any books that you guys can recommend aside from obviously Hacking the Human Mind?
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, there's so many really good ones. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Alchemy. I think that's absolutely brilliant. That's well worth the read. I think that if you're gonna read, I think one book on behavioural science that MichaelAaron or I had nothing to do with, that would probably be the one. It's amazing.
Yeah.
If I were to add one that was based in the world of behavioral science that maybe would go outside of applying to marketing and advertising, I think BJ Fogg and his Tiny Habits book is written so long ago now. I mean, I think it was over 10 years ago, maybe less. But I think that's a nice book to think about how behavioral science might apply outside of marketing and advertising.
Amazing. I don't think Tiny Habits has actually come up before, which is remarkable in itself, but we'll certainly link to that. We'll link, obviously, to Hacking the Human Mind, and I know that it's available to pre-order on Amazon. Is it available to link to on Harriman House's website, which would be my preference?
Absolutely. And, you know, Waterstones, Blackwell's, WH Smith, you know, you can go anywhere to buy it if people would rather go to another retailer.
Available from all good and bad bookshops.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
We're not picky. Yeah.
And then number 4, I can accept separate answers, or if this is something that you agree on, is we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest, who has to give the reason why. So could we dedicate this episode to someone?
Yeah, Richard and I chatted about it before the episode, and Richard just mentioned Alchemy by Rory Sutherland. He's been a generous supporter of our work and fan of just all those that are passionate about bringing more academics into marketing, making marketing broader than just communications. And he's just been very kind to us. So we'd like to dedicate the show to him.
Fantastic. This episode is very proudly dedicated to Rory Sutherland, everyone's favourite Rory. Fantastic. So, as I said just now, if you're listening to this episode, you'll find in the listing links to pre-order Hacking the Human Mind. I will link to your previous books too, and the recommendations, including Tiny Habits, which I'm certainly going to check out. How else can our listeners get more Richard and MichaelAaron?
We would invite everyone to come over to the consumerbehaviorlab.com and check out our podcast called Behavioral Science for Brands, available on any streaming platform that you may consume podcasts at.
Amazing. Well, the link to that will also be in this listing, so they shouldn't have to look too hard. Or should we, true to the stories shared, do we need some effort? So it's worth it when people get there. Listen, both of you, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure and a real privilege to catch you guys.
Fantastic. Really good to chat to you.
Thanks so much for having us.
No worries. And finally, thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed the pod, please do share and review it. Keep your questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online or email the mouthful that is call to action at gasp.agency.
Can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try and I try and I try and I try.